100 years ago, this past summer, a crisis occurred in the Balkans. Big surprise there. It was dramatic, it was human, including the death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie Chotek. It was not, however, the first crisis in the Balkans, nor, of course, as we all know, the last. There had been others. There had even been warfare in the Balkans. In 1876, 1877, there had been conflict in 1908, warfare in 1912 and 1913. There had been other crises and even other wars. But this time, the greatest cataclysm that humanity, at least European humanity, had seen since the plagues of the Middle Ages ensued. It produced consequences that were unimaginable at the time, unpredictable or at least unpredicted. It was an event which was catastrophic and pervasive, the consequences of which are with us today and were with us throughout the 20th century. It produced the end of no fewer than 4 major empires: the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, and the Ottoman. It produced the so-called springtime of nations, including some that had a historical legacy, like Poland, and others who'd never existed before, like Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia. And of course, the borders of these included the portents of future wars. In human costs, it was inconceivable even now, much less at the time. Some 9 million military deaths, 5 million civilian deaths, not counting the subsequent deaths caused by a pandemic of flu, poverty, and devastation. The technology of killing was advanced by quantum leaps. People learned how to kill each other from the air for the first time with airplanes and bombs, submarines, poison gas, and machine guns. Keep in mind that the most serious warfare in terms of human casualties that had occurred in the previous 100 years was not an international war at all. It was our own civil war. This was something else. The economic costs were huge, measured not only in dollars, but also in the loss of European preeminence, the isolation of trade that followed, the various economic crises, the rise of the United States, the social upheaval that occurred in several of the participants, Germany, Russia, Hungary, and of course, the other less tangible aspects. The loss of one of our panelists today, Frank Ferretti, refers to it as the loss of illusions, of self-confidence, the crisis of self-confidence that occurred among Europeans who had, of course, convinced themselves that such a thing could never happen. It's clear that this was a seminal event in the last century, one whose consequences are still with us, and one whose causes we are obliged to take a look at for a number of reasons. We look at it as observers, as columnists, as human beings who live in a dangerous world, and we wonder, or at least some of the people in this room wonder, if the dynamics that caused that cataclysm are being repeated today. Are we seeing the same combination of factors? Global factors, political factors, human factors, factors at the national level or at the individual level that are likely to lead or could lead to such a cataclysm again. Of course, we immediately add, and a good political scientist I would certainly add, we know that no 2 historical epochs are exactly alike, of course. As Mark Twain famously commented, I always like to cite scholars like that, history never repeats itself, but sometimes it rhymes. So we take a look at this not exactly whimsically, but looking for factors that seem to point in the right direction that might be leading to such a conflagration. And we also know that we cannot be complacent because we haven't had such a global conflict now since the end of World War II. Our own long peace, you might say. We must, with a sort of clear-eyed analysis, take a look at what factors may or may not be present that we should pay attention to because of the possibility of such conflict, or even, Lord help us, try to act to prevent. To help us do that, we've put together a panelist that includes both historians and, forgive me, some political scientists, some of people who have already written on this topic or thought about it, and others who probably didn't until they got an email from me. That's all right. We want exactly that kind of group of people who have focused on maybe contemporary politics and now are invited to look at it through the lens of these events. Our panelists include Professor Mark Steinberg from the University of Illinois, where he is professor in the Department of History. Mark Steinberg is a former editor of Slavic Review. He is the author of Pittsburgh Fin de Siècle from Yale University Press, and what I confess is my favorite history of Russia, which he's written with Nicholas Ryasanovsky. And so he clearly brings historical perspective. Also joining us is Frank Ferretti, former professor of sociology at the University of Kent in Canterbury, England. He is the author of numerous books on a wide range of topics. Of most interest to us today is his book, First World War, Still No End in Sight. I don't know if this is a sign of technology, but when I went to Pitt's library to access this book, I was able to do it electronically. Frankly, don't have the book physically, but I could read it from my home computer. I suppose that's an advance. So I plagiarized from you electronically. Frank is also a blogger and a commentator and does all the things that people do once they retire and don't have this job anymore. Joining us from Boston is Carol Sabbats. Carol is a research affiliate in security studies at MIT and also a research associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and East European Studies. She is a political scientist who works on once Soviet, now Russian policy, especially in the Middle East, and her involvement of Russia among its neighbors. In fact, one of her pieces is called "The Ties That Bind Russia's Evolving Relations with Its Neighbors." And being a modern person like the rest of us, she's also a blogger and has a piece called "The Costs of Novorossiya" in a blog that she probably publishes herself. I have no idea how that comes about, but I'll give the proper citation if you want. I'm also joined, I'm happy to say, by two colleagues here at the University of Pittsburgh. To my right, Gregor Tun, who's Associate Professor, Department of History. Gregor specializes in German and Central European history, but what is most intriguing to me is the scope of topics that he covers. In fact, he's one of my favorite titles of an edited book he did together with Mariusz Rentowski called Helpless Imperialists: Imperial Failure, Fear, and Radicalization, which certainly seems an appropriate topic for today. And I'm also intrigued by Das Ende der Utopien in der Vereinigung Europas. So I'm going to have to talk with you about that later. And on my left is Andy Konitzer, who is an extremely well-educated young man, having received his PhD from the Department of Political Science. He now serves as acting director of Russian and East European Studies here at Pitt. He works mostly on contemporary topics, including elections and regional relations in Russia, but has expanded to include work on the Balkans, including Serbia and Croatia, and is widely published and, of course, susceptible to various forms of leverage, which is how I got him into the chair today. So those are our panelists, and I would like to get things started by asking any of them who would care to jump in the topic about the global the global balance. To me, one of the most intriguing aspects of where we stand now is what one might call a multipolar system. We're no longer bipolar, probably not unipolar, but we're in a multipolar system. Aren't we then inevitably leading to the kind of competition and conflict that produced World War I?
I'll jump in if you want, Ron.
Please do, Carol, yes.
Okay. When you sent the questions last week, I have to admit I was a little bit surprised because a lot of the parallels that people draw about Russia are much more to Weimar Germany, resentment at the dissolution of empire, the resentment of how they were treated by the victorious, in quotation marks, powers and everything else. But the more I thought about it, the more I did see some similarities, but some very glaring differences. First of all, as you rightly mentioned, this focus on the Balkans, it's clear that Russia has not relinquished any interest in the Balkan area. In fact, as you noted last week when you sent us that lovely little picture of the statue, that Vladimir Putin was indeed traveling to Serbia. The other similarity I see is this policy driven by national pride. I think in the Russian case, it's this restoration of great power status. I think a history part that you did not mention, and I'm not a historian, the fact that Russia was concerned about access to the straits, egress from the Black Sea. I think we could talk about Crimea and current conflict in that context, and this whole idea of empires weakening and breaking up. But I think one of the biggest differences is that this multipolarity, if you want to call it that, is global this time. I think when we thought about it in terms of World War I, that it was very much a European, Eurasian phenomenon. And now you certainly would have to bring China into the mix. The very fact that Russia feels that it can direct its attention towards China, having been spurned by the West or having created this conflict with the West, I think makes it very different. I think we were talking specifically about Europe in the pre-World War I period, and now we're talking a much more global picture. And finally, I think the Russians see this multipolarity as a way to have a say. If it's unipolar, it's the United States, it's the West. Multipolarity, the term originally coined by Yevgeny Primakov, was a way of getting Russia into the act, to say Russia's here and it's important. And I think that makes it both similar and different to the period of, pre-1914.
Can I come in?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm also impressed by some of the differences. The one similarity, it seems to me, is the disorientation of governments across the world, the confusion within the political elite, which was very striking, especially in European societies in the early 20th century. I think that is very much the case today. But in every other respect, I see a number of very crucial differences. The first difference is that virtually every major power in the world is almost a status quo power, including Russia. I think although Russia may have its problems in the Crimea and elsewhere, it is essentially a very conservative, defensive status quo power that feels beleaguered, if not, sort of in the Ukraine or in that area, but in other parts of its borders. Secondly, the United States, which in many respects is the most powerful nation, is itself extremely confused and disoriented about what it should do in the world. Its behavior globally seems to be very erratic and lacks clear definition. And certainly in the European context, there is no real appetite for conflict. There's a fear of getting involved too much. And in every single intervention that we've seen, and there have been many, many interventions, there's continually the emphasis on caution, on not getting too involved, on a kind of hesitation, which indicates a wariness of going to war. I think the second big difference is that if you look at the First World War, France, Germany, Russia, all these societies had very clear geopolitical interests that were clearly and systematically spelled out. They were deeply entrenched and which were part of the self-consciousness of the political elites. I think today what's striking is if you look at the global scene, a nation like Britain, where I live, or Germany, or many other European societies, are very unclear about their own geopolitical place in the world. There is no real sort of appetite for politicizing geopolitical issues. And instead what you have is a number of actors kicking in who are often more responsible for global conflict. take, for example, the role of the media, which is much greater now than it was in the early part of the 20th century, which is continually inciting governments to get stuck in or get involved or asking questions that governments find very difficult to resist. Take the role of NGOs and humanitarian organizations, who are often the forefront of demanding action in Syria or in Libya or in the Ukraine or in a number of other societies. So the global situation has changed, and I think what's really interesting for me is how the role of government, particularly of foreign affairs, that domain of government, has altered in a very fundamental way from the early 20th century.
Mark, yes, I see you. Go ahead, Mark. Unmute. Mark has to be.
He is unmuted. He needs to do it himself.
You have to unmute yourself.
We are not muted.
We are not muted. Can you hear me now?
There you go. We got you now. Thank you.
All right. So you probably expect mostly I'm going to refer to the historical period, but actually I'm not in response to your question. But thinking about statements that have come from the Russian government through a lens that I think of as fundamentally historical, looking at the type of language and its echoes. And one of the things I want to pick up on is, one, the question of multipolarity, but also Carol's comment, I think quite right, that multipolarity is seen as a very positive, a beneficial thing from a Russian point of view, and maybe we should think about that as well, precisely as a way, as she said, to have its say. And one of the things that's striking to me is all these recent conflicts, Crimea, Ukraine, and other statements that have come especially from Putin, whose power is quite considerable in shaping policies, is precisely this concern with containment. He keeps using this word. Fearing that a bipolar world or a world dominated by the U.S. Would contain Russia, and the sense that it isn't so much that this is an unstable dynamic, having multipolarity, but it's potentially creates a different type of stability. One of the things I'm struck is Putin constantly makes the statement that he hates being dictated to by our, quote, Western partners. And I think there really is a desire to be treated as a partner, to not being humiliated, as he always says. And so he sees opportunities. He sees multipolarity as a chance not to necessarily expand endlessly or become a global superpower, but to really give a space for inclusion. So in a way, I quite agree with Carol's comment about that, and therefore dare us to think multipolarity is not unstable, but quite beneficial.
Gregor, yes, I was just going to comment. Okay. I think when we try to compare the situation, I don't think that Russia is like Germany in 1914, but if you want to look for a comparison, it's actually like Habsburg in 1914. So we have a power in decline who tries to conduct a small, low-level war, hoping it would increase its prestige again without risking anything or risking too much. And what we can see, of course, it has probably the same unintended consequences to create exactly the opposite, to further destroy, the power it still has. What we see here in Russia, I really think, is a situation that people anticipated in 1989 or 1990, that the Soviet Union would just not give away so easily, and it might lead to conflicts. And we had this surprising situation in 1990 and the years after that actually was a very quiet, very peaceful retreat of the Soviet Union, and 25 years later, out of a very different situation and the feeling of constant humiliation, imagined or not, real or not, they act now very differently, and we might have a situation out of helplessness, out of weakness, to create actually a dynamic that is potentially very dangerous and can lead to a major war. And this is a situation where actually no European power is prepared and eager to have war. I must say, I think that's the first interpretation I've heard of current events that emphasizes Russian not only weakness but decline, whereas almost all of the others say we have a resurgent power, a power that feels it's been dealt a raw deal and wants to make up for it, and is increasing its power and using its near abroad to increase that power. And in other words, the challenge comes from its rising, at least regional power, rather than its decline. Andy?
Yeah, I like what Gregor did with the Habsburg Empire on that, because I was trying to find what country is Russia playing at this point in the 1914 analysis, and I really do see this as a defensive move by a declining power, or a state that at least is not increasing. I do not see Russia as a revisionist state. Let me just put it that way. And when I'm looking at what's happened in Ukraine here in the last almost year now, it just seems to be the end of a long sort of march by the European Union and NATO towards interests that mattered for Russia. And so for what we've seen since basically 1991 is that the European Union and NATO sort of politely expanded, and Russia politely protested. There are occasional points when there was actually a flare-up, but up until really the situation last summer, or arguably also 2008 with the war in Georgia, there wasn't a situation where the stakes became so high that, two things happened. Either the stakes became so high that Russia found it in its interest to react, or it was aware of the fact that there was nothing that the West, Europe, United States would do if it reacted militarily. And so that's when you start to see this pushback. So I see this as sort of, if we're going to keep with this analogy, a sort of pre-1914 moment here, where that space, that buffer, that safety valve, or even floodplain, if we want to look at it, has now disappeared, and we've got powers that are now rubbing up against each other in uncomfortable ways. Sorry about that. But at this moment, really what Russia is playing is a defensive game and not a revisionist one.
Frank, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree. I've been in discussions recently with some Russian academics and colleagues, and the impression that they give is just how defensive and how insecure they feel about the world out there, and they find it almost incomprehensible that in Western media, Russia is kind of often represented as this power and ascendancy, this aggressive proto-imperialist power that is expansionist in its objective. And I think that the one thing that we often forget is that although Russia is often seen to be a person that or a country that initiates things, it is in general reacting. I mean, if you look at the experience since the 1990s, it's continually reacting to events beyond its control. And one of the things that is very rarely discussed is the role of the EU, for example, and the way in which the European Union itself has maybe unconsciously or unwittingly was kind of prodding the Russians into action, the way in which it almost incites Russia to react by its kind of encroachment upon areas of interest that are principally Russia's area of interest without thinking about the potential consequences. So I do think we need to have a more balanced view of Russia's geopolitical positions, which doesn't make it any less unpredictable, but it's more of a defensive, reactive unpredictability rather than a confident, expansionist one.
I feel like in a moment I'm going to have to jump in and resurrect the aggressive Russia image here, because I didn't expect to get so much consensus about the poor little defensive Russians after they carved up Georgia and they carved up Ukraine. And I might call on Cy to render that.
I was wondering whether defensive aggression might not be as deadly in its cumulative effects as aggressive defense.
Well,
in other words, what I'm saying is you could take a look at any one of those European powers before 1914, each one of them thinking they're acting very defensively. The Austrians feeling they have to move into an ex-Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, mobilization as a threat to make sure that that's swallowed, but in fact cumulatively building up a sense of crisis. That is, in fact, that there's a progression here which must be stopped.
In his magisterial work, Christopher Clark, whom I'm happy to say visited our Department of History, was talking about the Balkans, and he has a wonderful quote that I think fits this notion. He says, "It was not that the Balkan inception scenario, which was in fact the Serbian inception scenario, drove Europe forwards toward the war that actually happened in 1914, but rather the other way around. that it supplied the conceptual framework within which the crisis was interpreted once it had broken out. Russia and France thereby tied the fortunes of two of the world's greatest powers in highly asymmetrical fashion to the uncertain destiny of a turbulent and intermittently violent state. In other words, defensive or not, each one saw what was happening in this area, in this case the Balkans, as crucial to the future. And therefore, one might, of course, nations almost always claim that what they're doing is defensive. You nevertheless could have a crisis unless someone or some leader is willing to take that position and stop it. Jonathan.
Jonathan Harris, University of Pittsburgh. I wanted to take a slightly old-fashioned political science take on this. Over the last 20 years, the discussion of international relations has tended to ignore arms racing for reasons that I don't fully understand. And I think we have to reintegrate the concept of arms racing into our conception of multipolarity. The arms racing which helped to lead to World War I was a conventional one. And somehow we've forgotten that the arms racing, which continues at slightly lower acceleration now, is this incredibly destructive one. The Russian Federation is working very hard to modernize its most recent set of nuclear weapons. It's allied with the People's Republic of China, which is working at all levels to modernize its conventional forces, its navy, and its nuclear capacity. The North Koreans have a nuclear capacity which nobody knows is going to be used. To talk about multipolarity as similar in the current situation to the World War I situation without distinguishing between the sort of weapon systems that we have, I think is sort of a mistake.
Mark, did I see it? Or is that someone's hand up behind you? Yes, go ahead.
Behind me? No, it was me. Well, I just want to go back. Me?
Yes, go ahead, got you.
Yeah, okay. I just want to, leaving aside the nuclear question, which I think is important, back to this question of defensiveness or reactive, just very briefly. I mean, and one might argue if one's playing the game of who's Russia in, is it Germany or is it Austria-Hungary, or one might even say, is it Serbia in some ways, a nation concerned with its own national standing. Mostly, of course, one could argue that it's Russia. Russia is Russia, where, as I think somebody said, there was a sense of they had no choice but to intervene in 1914 because the cost geopolitically, domestically, in terms of Russia's identity as a Slavic protective power, of not intervening would be yet another defeat and a humiliation. And I think perhaps if Russia now is Russia in 1914, one needs to think about just those questions. Does Russia feel it has to intervene, as I think has been said, because it feels threatened? In other words, it's not an expanding power so much taking over Ukraine as Ukraine feels increasingly like a place that it will be defeated if it doesn't act.
Can I jump in?
Yes, go ahead, Carol.
I think we've sort of set up a false dichotomy here. It bothers me a little bit. I think that we could talk about Russia feeling that it is on the defensive, Russia feeling that it has been weakened by the collapse of the Soviet Union. You certainly hear this from people like Sergei Karaganov, who apparently is one of Putin's muses these days, who argued 20 years ago that Russia couldn't be a great power until it was actually the regional hegemon in the former Soviet space. And so I think you have to look at Ukraine, Crimea, Georgia, sort of in that context. But that defensiveness may actually lead to actions that we perceive as being aggressive. So I don't think it's an either or. And I guess Mark and I are really on the same page here about Russia feeling that it had to intervene in Ukraine, for example, because otherwise somehow it was going to lose its Slavic brother, its lesser brother, Ukraine's not really a state kind of thing, to the West. And Russia's feeling very defensive about how it perceives the West. So we have to put ourselves sort of into the mindset of Vladimir Putin and his entourage to sort of figure out how they're thinking.
Actually, Carol, that leads right into a question I was going to pose to you, which is, and it raises I mean, we're all, as I've learned from social psychologists, cognitive misers. That is, the world is so complex we have to simplify. And so we talk, as you just did, as we all did, about Russia wants this and Germany wants that or wanted that. My question is, and this too we learned from the pre-World War I period, what about the domestic politics of these issues? I don't mean public opinion, I mean factions in the leadership. Are there those who are arguing against Karaganov or are suggesting that this is a new world and we don't have to recreate hegemonic space? And do they, or are they likely to have any influence?
You're addressing that to me?
I am indeed. You can jump in if you want.
I'll take a stab at it. Unfortunately, Russia has become increasingly opaque. There was a period in the 90s and even after Vladimir Putin first became president in the early 2000s when we could trace what ministries thought, which particular people thought what about, situations. We have much less information today. So let me just put that out there as a caveat. I think that Putin, coming from the environment that he did, the KGB, has surrounded himself with the so-called siloviki, those from the power ministries, who really still hold on to what I would see as a Cold War view. And at the moment, they seem to be in ascendance. If the hope of the sanctions was that somehow the oligarchs who can't go visit their dachas in the south of France or their kids who are at Oxford and Cambridge would somehow intervene to get Putin to moderate his policies vis-a-vis Ukraine, then we were mistaken. Putin doesn't seem to be listening to them anymore, if he ever was.
Can I come in?
Yes, Frank, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that you raised a very important question about the role of domestic politics, because it's arguable that domestic pressure was one of the key elements in the drive to war back in 1914. And we have to remember that you had a radicalized labor movement in Germany, you had a revolution in Russia in 1905, and you had a kind of a powerful sort of pressure points being built up within Russia. Even in Britain, you had a growing set of crises, internal domestic crises. You had groups of militaristic politicians who were demanding some kind of a warlike policy. And I think that if you look around the globe today, this kind of domestic pressure, which played a very important role in the 1914, seems to be conspicuously either absent or much feebler than it would have been 100 years ago. And I think that's one of the big differences, that insofar as there is a clash or potential clash globally, it is not something that one can definitely argue it comes from the domestic political scene. It's not pressure from below. There isn't really that kind of tension that existed back 100 years ago. It's got a different source. I think that's one of the big challenges we have, is to isolate what the sources of conflicts are, which in many respects are not at all sort of similar to the ones that existed at the time of the outbreak of First World War.
Andy, I want to turn to you on this question because you're capable of talking about the domestic politics in two of the actors who are the focus of this, if not necessarily the most powerful, and that is Ukraine and Serbia. Are there factions there that seek to take advantage of, let's say, Russia's interest, defensive or not, in manipulating the power? Or are there those who are arguing this is not a sensible way to go for our country? I mean, is anybody in Serbia really interested in renewing the Russia-Serbians alliance, or is that just a Western media creation?
Well, I think symbolically there's a use to, the types of events that we saw last week in Belgrade. But I also think that for the public in Serbia particularly, there's also the realization that under all of that is really nothing. That it's a nice talk and makes everybody feel very good. That everyone likes brotherhood and the emotional feeling that they're getting out of it. But when you look at the actual geopolitical position that Serbia is in right now, the fact is it's surrounded by the European Union, almost surrounded by NATO countries. So the idea of suddenly becoming, now the 84th oblast of Russia or something like that is just not a very realistic option. I think that maybe what the government may be trying to do, and the public may support this to some extent if they realize it, is to try to play a Yugoslavia game there, trying to make themselves a security threat in some eyes, or a long-term sort of meta-security threat, I guess, to European member states, so that maybe they will consider restarting the enlargement process in the Western Balkans. But beyond that, I don't imagine that this is going to materialize in anything material. Russia's returned to the Balkans probably about 10 times since 1999 at least, and I still haven't seen the difference.
And Ukraine?
Well, in the Ukrainian case, I mean, it's much more complicated because of the fact that you do have, the way the population is bifurcated in geographical terms, that you actually do have a population in the east that does look to Russia as sort of a kin state, either quasi or real. And so we were talking about, I think, domestic public opinion that is bifurcated in a real way, and then also the fact that you've got real and potentially actionable economic ties and interests in the east, which will be harmed by being broken away from Russian sphere if indeed there was eventually EU membership, which of course is something that has been thrown around a lot, but we all know that that's not going to happen for 20 or 30 years anyway, if even then. So I think it's just a fundamentally different situation. If we're going to compare Ukraine and Serbia, just it gets talked about as the same thing, but all you really have to do is look at the map and you realize that it's in a realm of symbolic politics. So.
Gregor, I'd like to return to your points about Germany and the point that Carol made. One of the questions I was actually going to ask is, in terms of similarities, is this question of opacity. If you look at the scholarship leading up to World War I, there's a lot of talk about each side not knowing what the other was up to, fearing the consequences, having to act preemptively because it was so opaque. I guess my question is, do you see that, first of all, do you think that's accurate, especially with regard to perceptions of Germany from the outside, or German perceptions? And are there any modern, is it a modern analog that can be useful? Or are we now so open with the internet and tweeting and twerking and whatever else we do, that that's not a sensible, I guess it's not twerking. That I know enough about, I know that's not right. Tweeting, I guess. I mean, are we so open now that no country can be as opaque as we are making the Russians out to be, for example?
Yeah. No, I don't think. I think governments can still be very opaque, and we cannot know what's really going on. We don't know exactly what's going on actually in Russia in the government. But I think I want to point out to one related issue. In 1914, what caused the war was there was no mechanism actually of crisis prevention, no established mechanism of crisis prevention. There was only one reaction that seemed possible in 1914. This is a major war. There was no several level reactions in place how to actually deal with a crisis. And I think today we have a similar situation. There is no mechanism in place to deal with a crisis like that, because nobody prepared for a war any longer in Europe. And especially not with this kind of strange war. It's a very low-key war. It's not, Russia didn't invade Ukraine. It is an intelligence operation. They sent troops over there. At the beginning in Crimea, you can see the helplessness also of reactions, how to react to that. And I think that's maybe is a problem, a lack of imagination on the side of European, also I think American politicians, to put in place several options of reaction to a crisis as that. And it's in the moment they're improvising to find a solution, and we start with sanctions, and I think actually the sanctions work much better than people think. But of course the sanctions can in the end lead also to a further escalation, because is then Russia at the end really, or Putin as I say, really able then to retreat? Or do we have to think about a policy of de-escalation, a way to build a bridge, a golden bridge for Russia to retreat and not to lose his face, in a sense? So how do we manage declining powers? And that's, I think, the issue. And we didn't think about this beforehand, and that's what the problem is right now. We have to invent that now on the going, and that's, of course, very challenging.
Mark?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this issue of opacity that the problem isn't simply a question of knowledge, it's a question, as somebody said, of perception. And it seems to me that in 1914, there was a lot of knowledge already, at least thinking of what Russians knew about the rest of the world. I think they knew a lot, they just were full of a great many prejudices and presuppositions, and I think that may be true as well now. I think there is an issue of factual knowledge, but there's also the question of how we judge and the prejudices we work with.
One of the, a slight embellishment on that is this argument that you'll hear among political scientists especially, that the more states trade and the more they interact and people go back and forth, the less likely they are to engage in conflict. And this conversation is ended when you read that Germany and Great Britain were each other's largest trading partners, of course, before World War I. It certainly makes us wonder about whether familiarity breeds contempt or conflict. I want to stay on this a little bit longer on this issue of a declining power. Because couldn't one argue that the declining power in question was eager to flex its muscles and show that it can't be kicked around in areas that, frankly, are only of marginal significance, is the United States? That this narrative of decline that you read about, the rise of China, the loss of our elan and our trading position, and there are some in the United States who believe it so much that they feel like we can't let Russia overturn the post-war or post-Cold War order, because then nobody will take us seriously. Therefore, who rules in Donetsk really matters to us. Or frankly, who rules in Kohani matters to us. Does it really? And isn't this itself a function of a U.S. decline that might mimic that of the Austro-Hungarian Empire?
Can I jump in?
And any of my students
Ron, can I jump in?
Their grades. Yes.
Ron?
Yes,
can I jump in?
I see you.
I now inhabit this world of realists here at MIT. So my boss, Barry Posen, would argue that Ukraine is of no interest to us whatsoever. We shouldn't really care what the Russians are doing, that we need to marshal our limited resources and pick and choose the most important battles, in quotation marks. But I think we could do the mirror image of that and look at it from Russia's perspective as well, which is to say something about how Russia perceives Ukraine and whether or not it's being just totally opportunistic. I think this sort of, my politics will be very clear, by this oversimplistic, well, we didn't do X, Y, and Z in Syria, and we did this, and therefore Putin marched into Ukraine, I think is wrong. I think that the Russian policy is much more opportunistic, but from Putin's point of view, this is a vital national security interest for him. And if I could for a second, I want to go back to this question of domestic politics, because something was triggered in my mind. I think that it's not just that we can't figure out sort of who's really calling the shots. There was a wonderful article sometime last spring called Putin on the Couch, because people were trying to figure out what he was thinking, and we don't know. But I think that we have to put it into the context of not only the colored revolutions in the post-Soviet space, Putin and the Russian reaction to the Arab Spring, and then to see yet again people on the square, on Maidan Square and everything, triggered in him, oh my God, they could be coming for me next. And I think we have to understand it in that perspective as well.
Can I come in?
Frank. Yes, yeah. Please.
Yeah,
wait, Frank, can I hold you up for 1 second?
Yes.
I kept reminding myself, would everyone be sure, this is a little housekeeping, and sign this sheet, including you sign, and especially any of my students, make sure your name is on it. I'm sorry, Frank, go ahead.
Yes, just getting back to the American example and its possible decline and its global reaction to that. I think that it raises some very interesting questions, because when you look at American foreign policy, it does seem to lack a coherent geopolitical strategy. I think when you look at events like Libya, which seems almost bizarre from an external point of view, when you look at the vacillations over Syria and the kind of confused statements that kind of come out of Washington, when you look at the way in which events in Somalia and elsewhere are kind of represented, you get the impression that American foreign policy seems to be made up as it kind of goes along. And that leads me to a kind of more broader kind of question, which is, it may well be the case that the United States is by no means the only sort of society where foreign policy has an unstable, volatile, fluid, ill-defined character. And when we're thinking about opaqueness and, do we really know what these different governments are up to? It may well be the case that the governments themselves are, lack that clarity that they might have had back in 1914, where there was a very clear ethos of national interest, a very clear ethos of geopolitical interest, because the thing that strikes me is the unpredictable, confused way in which governments manage their foreign policy. And I think that is something that is very rarely captured in discussions at the moment. But who amongst ourselves can possibly impose a clarity on that, a kind of an interpretation on that is really objective and seems to make sense?
I want to pick up on that confusion string a little bit, and this may throw us off of the topic a bit, but one thing that has not been mentioned, and I think it might help us understand this confusion, as a difference from 1914, is the presence of institutions, or the institutional density and the amount of organizations that are currently operating or running in the international system. And I think that this helps us understand. In some respects, we've been mesmerized by the tanks and the rockets and the armies moving back and forth, and we're looking at this as Russia's territorial expansion. But instead, what I see is a clever use by Putin, particularly, of military power and institutions. So in this respect, using the institutions against the people that set up the institutions in order to basically serve their role in the international system. So, rather than look at this as, what's going on in Crimea and Ukraine and Georgia as Putin's, the first step on the march to Kiev or Tbilisi or something like that, instead it looks like a very clever way for him to stop EU and NATO expansion towards Russia's borders or areas where it has national interest. Because once you've established these frozen conflicts in place, it essentially makes it impossible, according to the institutional arrangements that work within the European Union and NATO, for these countries to become members of the other alliance, or the transatlantic institutions. And that's something that's actually unheard of when you think about it in the terms of 1914, that essentially this is military power and rules being used together to achieve global aims, or at least regional aims, for Putin. And now I just went sort of down the Russia-Ukraine rabbit hole there for a little bit. But then generally speaking, when we talk about the situation with Syria and U.S. inactivity or vacillation or whatever, all of these states are trying to work out how to operate in a system where at least you have to nod to the rules. You can use the rules, you can still attack people, but you've got to come up with your fig leaf, essentially. And in some respects, it's not just a fig leaf. Putin's found a wonderful way to essentially take institutions and rules and use them against opponents.
I ask a question to Andrew?
Yeah.
Andy, it's not what I agree with what you say, the game that's played here, but doesn't it produce exactly the opposite effects? It strengthens actually NATO, and it strengthens also the European Union. It leads to a remilitarization in Western Europe, so exactly the opposite effects of Putin wants.
Initially, when we saw the situation in Ukraine and in Crimea and Eastern Europe, I remember talking to some people and saying, well, Putin has done exactly the opposite of what he was trying to do. He's now unified Europe and NATO against him. But we haven't seen that yet. I haven't seen the actual unification. And if we talk about, the European Union acting like a foreign policy entity, like a state, for instance, we still see a lot of vacillation, a lot of division. Every time Putin steps back a little bit, people start to have doubts about whether or not he was really a bad guy in the situation or not. But even beyond that issue of not seeing the strengthening that we would predict out of this rationally, there is still the fact that the European Union is so rule-bound to the rules of expansion and enlargement and conditionality that it would not accept a Moldova, a Ukraine, or a Georgia as Putin has now created these states.
Except it did accept Cyprus.
And it swore it's never going to do it again.
Oh, I see. In a way, in a way, as the head of an EU center, and I've watched us all beat up the EU for both things, being too weak, too vacillating, too confused on the one hand, and too provoking Russia, aggressive, and getting involved in areas outside its sphere on the other. I have to say, I think that such arguments are misplaced. In a way, let me phrase it in the broadest possible terms. The EU was a countermodel to traditional national politics of power, or even national alliances. It didn't have, and still doesn't have, much military. It joined together as a model of how states might cooperatively work voluntarily according to certain norms of how they treat their own citizens, their government, and how they operate, and try to radiate what generally is concerned as soft power to attract states. It didn't force Ukraine to join. They never offered membership. It was never even considered. And they negotiated for almost 10 years to come up with this agreement, hardly pressing. Now, it's true they are a weak actor militarily, but in a way, hasn't the Russian action in Ukraine, whether defensive or not, thrown out that once hopeful model of an alternative way of organizing global politics and brought us back to old-fashioned global balancing with its dangerous consequences? And stop picking on Brussels.
Yeah. But I mean, the EU now is much more divided than it was before the whole Ukrainian crisis began. I think you have to remember, if you look at a country like Italy and the way it kind of self-consciously distanced itself from a lot of the EU policies. In France and Germany, there's a lot of ambivalence about what has happened within the EU, and arguably, if you look at the result of these events, you would argue that EU as a global diplomatic player is a little bit more fragile and weaker today than it was a year or two ago.
I would certainly agree. Some of it is, after all, a product of national states, which remarkably still retain their national prerogatives. The French in Africa, the Germans on economic issues, and of course, 5 states, for example, have still not recognized Kosovo. So I want to broaden us a little bit to the question of ideas. We're sort of leading up to that. We have seen in a lot of the literature a notion that before World War I, there was a certain national ideology, whether an imperial one held by the British, to some extent held by the Germans, a sense of national interest that was strong and almost unchallengeable. I think it was in your book, Frank, I was reading about how the idea of empires was totally accepted. Nobody questioned it. Of course you could take over other parts of the world and civilize them and all of that. Now, I guess my question is, are there prevalent ideologies now that are, in a way, putting blinkers on national leadership because they must act in a certain way, whether it's the United States or the EU or Russia, and are these ideologies subject to evolution in a way that might not lead to conflict? Love to get us into prediction. Yeah.
Okay, I'll jump in here. When I saw your question about ideology, my first reaction is what ideology? Because I don't see any unifying ideology on either side of the divide, if you want to have Russia on one side and the European Union and the United States on the other side. But then my second reaction is that Putin is actually, and Russia is actually trying to create an ideology. That this whole idea that we Russia, we are the moral force in the world, and look at the decadence of Europe and the decadence of the U.S. and the anti-gay marriage and all the other issues that are attendant to it, and we have this very odd marriage of convenience, maybe marriage of true belief of the Russians on the one hand and the far right parties in each of the European states, whether it's Marine Le Pen or some of the or Orban in Hungary, it's a very, to my mind, it's sort of the far right and getting together, and Putin is clearly not a communist, but it's this authoritarianism, this question of values that we have somehow betrayed. We also have the question of the role of the Orthodox Church, which we haven't talked about at all. The church was operative in Ukraine and may have had sort of an evil hand in fomenting some of the difficulties. The church is now operating in some of the Orthodox parts of the former Yugoslavia, also trying to promote sort of a pro-Russian idea here. So somehow the church, this kind of religious fundamentalism, although I hate that word, seems to be the one operational rule or ideological rule, at least that Putin is trying to use. For our part, I think we've abandoned, because we've seen the problems with democratization, we kind of presumed that the former Soviet bloc, East European states, and the parts of the former Soviet Union, how could they not want to be capitalists and how could they not want to be Democrats? And all of a sudden we're learning that they're not all that interested in some of that stuff. So we've had to rethink what our ideological premises are.
It's funny you mention that, because next week on October 27th, we're going to have a visit from Francis Fukuyama. And I think every single person in this room, everybody is lined up to say, so?
Exactly.
Frank.
Can I come in? Yeah, I think it's right that Russia is one of the few nations that is self-consciously trying to construct an ideology. And I think Putin has made a lot of effort, put a lot of resources into the ideological domain. It's very difficult to say how successful that is, although by all accounts it's having a bit of an impact. But what's very striking is that in Europe itself, the debates are really about, in France, what does it mean to be French? In Britain, we're having a debate about, what does it mean to be British? In Holland, what does it mean to be Dutch? There's a real lack of clarity about national purpose, national ideology. And the reason why there is these debates or confusions isn't because EU is seen to be so legitimate, such a powerful ideological force, but just simply because within Europe itself, there is no real ideological or nationalistic kind of culture that can reinforce or underpin any kind of political objective. And the other problem that's linked to that is that the military in all of these countries is very much marginalized. In 1914, the military had an honorable role to play within most Western societies. It was really in the mainstream of political culture, of institutional culture. Today, the military is seen very much as a kind of almost an embarrassment. It no longer has that kind of patriotic, glorified role that it had in the past, except for possibly in Russia. And I think that's one of the big differences between the Russian context and the European context.
Interesting.
So, can we rest easy thinking that nationalism, or maybe supranationalism at the state level, has been eradicated? We don't have to worry about it, certainly from the Dutch, who are always such troublemakers, that it's now been eradicated, and therefore one of the primary causes of World War I is no longer with us. Or is that too radical a statement? Let me ask you about Germany, Gregor. I couldn't avoid. How could you not? You knew I was going to ask it.
I think we really live in a world, especially in Western Europe, of utmost pragmatism and almost without any ideology. People just want to do business and live well. And of course, in the moment, the European Union is in a crisis in the sense since the Euro crisis. But I think Putin's or Russia's attempts to create an ideology I always see it as a sign of weakness, because they have to create something to keep people from emigrating. They have almost millions of people emigrating to the West. Even the oligarchs park their money in the West and spend their vacations in the West. And now they built this grand scheme of, new Eurasianism. It's actually a very old idea, not very imaginative. This comes from the 1920s already, as a reaction to the Russian Revolution and to the decline there. So I think I see only helplessness in this moment and desperation, and that's what we really deal with. And I see the consisting or the persistent attraction of the European Union and the Western world actually also to Russia and also to Putin, and trying to counteract here. So Europeans and Americans should be much more self-confident and react carefully and manage decline here in a more imaginative way than has been done in the last 25 years.
But you don't dispute the decline.
Russia's decline. Yeah, I don't.
Oh,
dispute
I
that.
thought you meant their own.
No. I don't I dispute that. I don't see that much decline.
Because you said the way you said it sounded like you were saying they should be more confident in their own decline.
No, sorry. More confident in trusting, the societies they built and the attractiveness of those societies also to, other countries around.
I can't help but find it troubling that we should put our faith in crass pragmatism, but I suppose that's a conclusion. That is the conclusion of your statement. Let me take one final. I've held you all, and I want to, but I can't. I absolutely have to raise one other idea. It's not exactly ideological, but when you read the histories of this period, you are struck by what you might call the civilizational arrogance. We're beyond that. Look, we haven't had a major war since Napoleon. We are too evolved for conflict. We've had all these crises. We've been able to avert them. And people believe, or seem to believe, in the impossibility of conflict. And my question is, now we've had what Graham Allison called our new long peace since the end of World War II. We have nuclear weapons, which fearfully terrify everyone. We've had terrible crises, even wars, but no global conflagration. Are we similarly now seduced by the idea that such a conflagration could not happen, and therefore make it more likely because we simply don't think it will happen? It's like my students getting an F. So they're equally deluded if they think it won't happen.
I
scared everybody.
Yeah, you have in a sense. Let me jump in a little bit. I think, look, during the Cold War, I think it was understood by us and by the Soviet Union that there were certain rules of the game. And they pushed and they prodded and they played global chess, but it was presumed that, except for perhaps the exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the 1973 war in the Middle East, that the nuclear weapons would not be used, period. And it didn't matter so much what happened in Vietnam or even what happened in the Middle East, except, again, with the exception of 73. I'm not sure we have those rules today, to be very honest with you. So I think that that's one piece of it. One of the things, that the chip on Russia's shoulder that I keep writing about is that Russia feels that it wasn't part of the rule setting for this post-Cold War era. And one of the things I think it's trying to do is to redefine the rules of the game so that it has more room for maneuver. The other thing that does concern me in terms of nuclear weaponry is that the Russians are now talking about investing in their nuclear arsenal. They're talking about investing in their military almost beyond the capabilities of their GDP. And every time they threaten about the missiles in Kaliningrad and everything else, I think that it's sort of tempting fate. I really don't think that they use them, but then again, I didn't think they'd invade Crimea either, so I'm not sure how good my instincts are here. But I think that for them, it's the fallback, whereas for us, we're not thinking in those terms.
There is one parallel with 1914 and the nuclear weapons. That is, it is the military. Every nation knew, not what and any other nation intended, but if there was a mobilization by one of the major powers, in fact, it would entail the potential of going down to defeat without firing a shot if you didn't mobilize on the other side. And everybody had studied, they could watch the rehearsals of the mobilization, which were basically show up at the mobilization point at the moment that you are there, because otherwise it will get disrupted. And of course, the whole Russian policy nearly fell apart because they tried to interrupt the plan and then went ahead with it anyway. So in fact, that part, when you say people thought that civilization couldn't come to an end, there was a sense that it could suddenly and dramatically if one nation decided to do so. And we know this because in Moltke's discussions, just before the mobilization, he said mobilization means the end of civilization. So civilization could be terminated. And then, of course, they toasted each other once they made the decision to go for bank.
So they saw the mobilization of their arms, even though they weren't nuclear, as incredibly
as they decided, and the Kaiser and Nicholas are writing back and forth. A war against each other means the monarchical principle will go down. Somebody's going to have to lose. So they saw this as a big deal and a very possible deal always. And I think the same thing goes for the nuclear option here. And what I most see in this world that I don't see in the world of 1914 is the sub and supra organizations that exist. We now have all over the world sub-organizations. Right. We have it in eastern Ukraine, we have it in Syria, we have it in Iraq. These are not calculable in the same way that nation-state reactions are.
That's a good point. That's true. And there are supra-organizations, including those that include Russia, like the OSCE and others, which take it upon themselves to try to act in these crises. I will say I do find it dubious the claim that Russia makes. You're quite correct that they're not involved in the setting of the post-Cold War order, since they signed on to the Paris Charter, they signed on to the 1994 agreement, taking nuclear weapons, agreeing to respect the territorial integrity. They signed up with the Russia-NATO Council. I mean, they have their own PCA with the EU. It's fine afterwards to say, well, nobody talked to us. They were clearly price takers, as the economists would say, but they were there at the table, it seemed to me, and did agree. Only that your point on ideology trumps that.
But they were never at the table as an equal member. You know, they are in this, in this NATO partnership, but they're not an equal. They're not offered ever a full membership in NATO, and I think that's what it means being treated equally.
And they saw the West as not fulfilling certain parts of their deal, and then if that fails as a way out, then you can always just do the Putin-Yeltsin cut, that Yeltsin sold the country out, and now the real Russian is in charge, and we don't necessarily need to pay for that.
That's right. Actually, I was thinking of when you made your point, Carol, that somebody else signed on to the rules, which the new leadership no longer considers
and Russia
binding.
was. And Putin's response would be, well, the Russia of the 1990s was in chaos. It really didn't count.
That's right.
We're back now, and we didn't sign on to this. I agree with you.
Well, let me end as I began with a quote from Christopher Clark. Did I mention that he was here at the University of Pittsburgh? I think I did. His wonderful quote, he says, "The outbreak of war in 1914 is not an Agatha Christie drama, at the end of which we will discover the culprit standing over the corpse in the conservatory with a smoking pistol. There is no smoking gun in this story, or rather, there is one in the hands of every major character."
Right.
I don't know if that makes us feel better or worse, but I think it's a brilliant analysis. Not as brilliant as those we heard today, and for that, I want to take a moment to thank Carol Sabbats and Mark Steinberg and Frank Ferretti, as well as my colleagues Gregor Tun and Andy Conitzer and Cy Drescher, and all of you who participated. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ron. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.